what those requirements are.
That's true. A real good point is E&O coverage goes from year to year to year. It's not like your homeowner's policy where, if you were to discover that, you had a kerosene tank in your backyard and it's been polluting your neighbors for the past 20 years, you would go back and make claims for each policy that was in effect for the last 20 years. It's not the way E&O works. E&O works as you buy 12 months worth of coverage, and if you get tagged with a lawsuit during that time frame, you tender it to the coverage that's in force the day you get served with the lawsuit, not the policy that was enforced back when you did the transaction. So Jim's got a good point, which is you might comply with this year's policy and then get sued 2 years later and be looking at a policy and say, oh, well, I didn't really comply with this. There's not really any way around that other than to just try to be as careful as possible and comply with the policy that's in effect, because the things don't really change that much. They seem to have locked into the qualifications for coverage. Most of them always are you've got to list it through another broker in the office. So I guess if I were going to leave you with one piece of advice on that, it would be list it with somebody else in the office. Okay, so if there's no other questions about that, let's launch into the AVID. I'm not seeing any other hands, so yes, let's go into the AVID. How many people are using the AVID right now?
Everybody.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good. It's good that you're using that required form. Right, exactly. Well, it's like eating your vegetables. Sometimes the things you have no choice are good for you. All right. So let's take a look at this thing. We've got about 20 minutes to talk about it, and to be quite frank, it's not the most difficult form in the world to deal with. It's pretty self-explanatory. The purpose of the form is, Andy, give the buyer more knowledge about the property. And as we all know from the famous academician Elmer Faber, knowledge is good. So let's talk about the AVID and talk about why it was kind of brought into bear. Many years ago, CA office attorneys like myself, what are the problems that you're seeing in defending agents out there? And I guess universally, one of the big problems, or perhaps the most significant problem that we saw, was how are we defending agents, and how are we proving that they did their reasonably competent visual inspection? So let's touch the button and go down to the next slide. All right. This was pretty much what we saw in about 99.9% of all cases we were defending on TDS issues. We would look at the section where the TDS lists, did you do your visual inspection? Check your box. Yes. What items do you note? And that would be it. Agent recommends buyer get a professional home inspection. The problem with that is that it doesn't really show that you've done your visual inspection. And you might have done it. I mean, you might have done a great job walking through and detailing all the issues that you saw. But if that's all you put on there, it's going to be real hard to prove that you did that. So the idea was, if you create this form that makes you go through every single room in the house, that you're going to write down more. And if you write down more, it's going to be easier to prove that you did your job. And next slide. What you've got to do, no big surprise here, it's right on the front page of the form. Reasonably competent, diligent visual inspection of the reasonably accessible areas of the property. So how do you do that? Well, you walk through the property. You take a look, and you're looking for red flags. Now, I have a kind of an issue with what it says on the front page here, which is California law does not require the agent to inspect the following. Areas that are not reasonably and normally accessible, areas that are off the site, public records or permits, common areas of planned developments. Well, there is a law, there is part of 2079 that does say Agents don't have to go off-site. They don't have to check permits. They don't have to do this. They don't have to do that. And that's a great law if you're representing just a seller. But if you're representing a buyer as well, you get tagged with the fiduciary duties. And the fiduciary duties in California are broader than the duties of Section 2079 of the Civil Code, and they actually put some additional responsibilities on you if you're representing the buyer or if you're a dual agent. So dual agents, selling agents, sometimes you're going to have to go beyond the mere words of this statute, and sometimes you're going to have to disregard what this says about not being required to do these certain things. So that being said, do I want you going off-site and making inspections of public records? Absolutely not. You know, do I want you crawling up on a roof and looking for things, or crawling into an attic and looking for code violations? Absolutely not. So how do we reconcile those two statements? How is it? Am I moving around too much for you, Andy? I can see the camera following me around. So how do we reconcile those two statements? If the law says you got to do certain things, then how do you get around this, and how do we not get into areas that are beyond our expertise and beyond our scope? Well, let's back up a little bit and talk about where these duties come from. They start right here with the code section. Reasonably competent, diligent visual inspection. Back in the 90s, there were a number of court cases that came out that interpreted this thing that were really, really good for brokers. It started off with Sweat versus Hollister, one of the great cases of all time, which basically says, as an agent, you have to disclose certain things, but you don't have to disclose what the significance of that particular thing is. So in other words, you see a stain on the ceiling, you disclose stain on the ceiling. You don't have to then go the next step and say, by the way, stains on the ceiling can be indicative of a number of things. One is probably a roof leak, but it could be something else. It could be, you know, an air conditioning unit up there that's leaking with a condensate line, or it could be that there's a roof leak and you have mold in your attic, because mold and water go together really nicely. So Sweat versus Hollister talks about that. And it says you don't have to disclose the ramifications, only the actual facts. Then there was another case that came out that was fantastic, Wilson versus Century 21 Great Western. That was the famous case of agents don't have x-ray eyes. You're only supposed to note, and you're only tagged with the obligation of noting what you can see. Century 21 versus, Wilson was a case about a guy who sued a broker because the broker didn't see that the foundation wasn't bolted with the appropriate J-bolt. And the court said, well, come on, you know, how are you going to know that from a visual inspection? Robinson versus Grossman, another one of my all-time favorites. That's the one that says that an agent doesn't have to verify facts that are listed by the seller. So if you, as an agent, say, well, the seller is saying that the cracks in the stucco are just normal stucco cracks and can be fixed with elastomeric paint, which is what happened in the Robinson versus Grossman lawsuit. If you say that and say, you know, that's what the seller says, I haven't investigated this myself and I don't intend to, that shifts the burden over to the buyer to do those inspections for himself. So real great cases and real great results. And in the mid to the late 90s, it was real easy to defend real estate brokers based on these things. But then a case came along called Field versus Century 21 Cloud and Forness. Came right out of our backyard, actually, right as I was kind of getting into the business. And I actually happened to know the lawyer that prosecuted the case on behalf of the Field, and I know the guy who defended Century 21 Cloud and Forness. They're both very good friends of our firms. And this was a bad case, because what came out of it was, well, it's a classic example of the old adage that bad cases make bad law. And without going too deeply into the facts, what happens is the Fields are buying a piece of rural land out in the East County of San Diego. There's a big water tank on it, and the big water tank says Otay Water District. Otay is an area in eastern San Diego. And the buyer asks the agent at some point, what does that mean? And the buyer says, oh, or the agent says, well, it means that they got the right to put a water